Hey there, my name is Alexis, and I'm going to show you how I turn this space into a mobile shop vac stand with plywood storage underneath and storage for my work lights when they're not in use. So this build consists of 2x4s and plywood that came from one of my old projects, a modular skate box that unfortunately got destroyed a few months back, so I'm reusing that plywood to serve my workshop now. So I designed this stand to have an irregular shape because it's really close to the entrance of my garage. So one end will have a depth of 15 inches while the other end that's closest to the entrance of the garage to have a depth of 12 inches. So I had to take an extra step and cutting a couple angle cuts on the 2x4s at the front end. And that measured to about 4.75 degrees. And I just had to make sure I cut the angles on the right side of the 2x4s when I do this cut for the front piece. So once I make that first cut at one end of the 2x4, I have to flip it 180 to cut it at the other end of that 2x4. And as for the sides, it's essentially the same thing, except you're only making these angled cuts on one end of each piece, while the other ends can be cut at a normal 90-degree angle. And once you have all your 2x4s cut to length, you can then screw everything together using 2¼ inch or 2½ inch long screws, making sure you pre-drill every time you install your screws because you never know when it comes to 2x4s that they can easily split on you if you're not careful. So I expected these 2x4s to be a little warped, but not this warped, but it's gonna serve its purpose regardless. So I just carried on and started tracing the outlines for the bottoms of the shelves using the 1/2 inch plywood. So I marked the outline using a Sharpie and then I cut everything using a jigsaw. So one of the main reasons to making this mobile cart in the first place is I use my shop vac whenever I'm using the circular saw or my jigsaw, and I have it laying on the floor, and when I'm doing longer cuts, the hose gets snagged on either the edge of the work table or on the edge of the workpiece, and it just gets really bothersome at times, especially when I'm trying to make a really consistent cut. So by having the shop vac at the same elevation or higher than the workbench, it essentially reduces the chance of it getting caught, if not eliminates it completely. So once the shelves have been made, next is to cut the plywood walls, and I'm also using 1/2 inch plywood here. And I'm going to have the mobile cart stand at about 36 inches tall, so I'm going to cut the plywood walls to about 32 inches long to account for the height of the caster wheels, which stand at about 4 inches tall. And to account for the different depths, I made one plywood wall 15 inches wide while the other one is 12 inches wide. So I initially was planning on using 2x4s and a skateboard truck as the feet for the stand, but after accounting for the weight, it wasn't working well, so that's why I went with casters. So disregard anything you see that aren't caster wheels because they will be getting removed later on in the build. So in the next step, I'm installing the plywood walls to the shelves, and I use about 6 screws per side on each shelf. And since the plywood walls are only a 1/2 inch thick, I used 1¼ inch long screws, and I decided to install a handle on one side of the mobile cart. It's probably not necessary, but I thought it might be at the time, so in the future I may take it off depending how often I use it. So for the shelf that's going to be holding my plywood scraps, I decided to install this back support piece here out of plywood because I want to store larger pieces of plywood here, and if it didn't have this back brace, it would likely fall off the instant the mobile cart moves around. As for the caster wheels, I'm going to be reusing the caster wheels that came with my furniture dolly. This is my spare dolly that I don't really use, so instead of going to the store and buying new ones, I'm just going to repurpose these and give these wheels a second life essentially because it was just collecting dust in the garage. So since these caster wheels came from a furniture dolly, I couldn't reuse the hardware that came with it because of the difference in thickness of my mobile cart. So I had to use a nut and bolt to install the caster wheels on the side that's only going through 1/2 inch plywood, while on the other side I have to go through 1/2 inch plywood and a 2x4. So in this case I just used a 2-inch long screw and it was nicely secured there, though I wish I had used a washer, but it seems to be just the right size. But the heads of these screws are just slightly bigger than the holes of the caster wheels, so it just barely fit, but it's good enough for me. So I just rinse and repeat and add the other 3 caster wheels, and then the tool cart is essentially ready to be used. Now I can start storing all my plywood scraps on the bottom shelf. And as you can see, the back brace is supporting a lot of them, so it was definitely a good idea to have some kind of back support here. Unfortunately, because I used some 2x4s that were a little warped, there was one side of the card that was waddling a little bit, so I remedied this by adding a small strip of 1/8 inch thick hardboard in between the caster and the plywood bottom, and it was perfectly stable after that. One final thing I wanted to add was a way to hold my work lights underneath the top shelf, and I found out that using this old bicycle tube was a perfect way to hold it. And I just used these pan head screws to secure the tubes to the underside of the plywood. And there's actually a bit of a trick that you have to do to install these screws because you're screwing into rubber. The rubber tubing has the tendency to turn with the screw because it's gripping onto the threads. So what I found out that worked for me was I would install the screw counterclockwise as if I'm trying to uninstall the screw. And by doing so, you kind of burn a hole through the rubber due to the friction from the screws. So once that hole is made, you can install the screw almost all the way in, though it does bind a little bit at the end. So what I did is I installed the screw about 80% of the way in, then I repeat the process for the second screw. But since the first screw is holding onto that rubber, I can go all the way in with the second screw, and then I could just finish the first screw after the second screw has been installed. I hope that made sense. I'm not good at explaining stuff like this sometimes. Essentially just go 80% in with the first screw and then 80% in with the second screw, and then you finish up the first screw and then go back to the second screw. So once I secured the rubber tubing on one end, I can go to the other end and install the pan head screws there. I just made sure I kept the rubber tensioned so that the rubber can nicely hold the work lights without having to worry about it sagging. Then I just cut off the excess. Later on, I did add an additional screw to either side just to make sure it's properly secured. And then it was just for me to test the fit, and it held the lights pretty well, although there was a bit of wiggle room in the middle for it to potentially fall out. So I added one more screw in between the two lights, and it was perfectly secured after that. And that's pretty much the end of the build. So thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. I've been wanting to make this for a little while now. This space has been poorly used for the past couple of years, and I just been wanting to make something for this for a while. And now that I've just picked up this new shop vac, it's super strong. It's great for my circular saw and my jigsaw. So it was just a perfect time to build this mobile cart out. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Leave a like, consider subscribing, follow me on Instagram. You know the deal. Yeah, subscribe to see new videos coming soon, hopefully within the next couple of weeks. And yeah, thanks again and take care.